Well, I'll get us started. It'd be my pleasure in a few moments to introduce our speaker, Mitchell Beer. Thanks everyone for joining. Before we do, please join me in acknowledging that our campus is located on traditional, unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and that the work of reconciliation is the responsibility of our congregation and of all Canadians. Our goal is to educate ourselves and all who have ears to hear, to be of service to those who are at risk, and to advocate for justice. And now I'm delighted to next get going on our talk this morning. Very interesting talk, I think, about finding common cause in climate action, and is something we need to do as we focus on this problem. So in the 2.5 years since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 1.5 degrees C Pathways report, setting a 2030 deadline for humanity to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 45%, we've seen a wave of public concern and action to confront the climate emergency. Despite the severe restrictions and intense stress of a global health emergency, the pace is picking up. In government action at all levels, grassroots demand, and a growing response from major investors and much of the business community. Yet atmospheric carbon concentrations are still rising, climate impacts are mounting, and the annual emissions are expected to continue their upward march once the pandemic eases. Many of the world's biggest carbon polluters are adopting more ambitious climate targets ahead of this year's United Nations conference in Glasgow, COP26. But the pace still isn't quick enough, largely because many countries, including Canada, are trying to hold on to the old economy based on fossil fuels while they begin charting a course to decarbonize. Eventually, but over too long a time horizon, to get the climate crisis under control. There's no way to greet a global transition that could create more than 65 million jobs and $26 trillion in economic activity by 2030, while delivering cleaner air and water and healthier, more resilient communities. Attend this session, you're here, and today you'll be learning about why this shift can be more about opportunity and gain, not loss and pain. And with that, I introduce Mitchell. Mitchell Beer is a former co-chair of First Unitarian Social Responsibility Steering Committee and publisher of The Energy Mix, a free thrice weekly e-digest on climate change, energy, and carbon-free futures. He traces his work in renewable energy and energy efficiency back to 1977, in climate change to 1997. A proudest moment was building a model wind turbine out of stir stick straws with his then 11-year-old daughter, a long ago YRUU alum. And improv comedy practices are part of the best parts of his week. In October 2019, he gave a TEDx talk on how to open conversations on climate change solutions outside the bubble of climate concern. Please join me in welcoming Mitchell, and Mitchell, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Mike. Good morning, everybody. And it's just so nice to see familiar names, familiar faces in the participant list. I'm really grateful to be here. I'll just share my screen and see what else needs to be done to actually make the slides come up properly. I'm astonished that worked. Okay, well, welcome. And again, thanks everybody for being here. As I can't advance my slides now, something had to happen. As Mike said, I'm publisher of the Energy Mix. We began in May 2014, and we've been monitoring and following and trying to keep track of everything that's happening in the climate change space ever since. I will just mention that subscriptions to the Mix are free, and you can find your way to the subscribe button from the link. But the goal is essentially to help people keep track of a very fast moving and I'll say complex space, just because it goes in so many different directions at once. The ground I'm hoping to cover today is, first of all, just a quick check-in on where we stand with the climate crisis, the road to the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, in Glasgow this November. The wave of opportunities, as you just heard, in the things that we need to do to get the climate crisis under control. Sort of a late-breaking section that I've called Spin and Substance, because with a lot of what we've been hearing lately on the road to climate solutions, it's sort of interesting and a bit challenging to decode, because there's good news, bad news all rolled together in one in some cases. And then what I hope will be the most useful part of this talk, and that is how to take action and really where to start. Because once you start looking at it, there are so many things not only that we need to do, but that we can do to actually get this challenge solved. I need to do one thing on my screen here. Okay. I'm not going to take a lot of time focusing on the crisis. It's what we always do, but you already know that material. That's why you decided to be here at what feels like 8 a.m. on Sunday morning in Eastern Standard Time. But I will say that the big pivot that I think we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years in the way people think about, talk about, fret about climate change is that so many of us, so many people seem to have gone from a comfortable sense that, yeah, this was something we needed to deal with, but it was way in the future. It'll affect our grandchildren, to this, which it most assuredly will, but to this horrified sense that it's here, it's now, we can see it around us, it's right in front of us, and therefore all is lost, there's nothing we can do about it. And it's frustrating, astonishing, probably understandable that a lot of people have made that shift right away without stopping at that midpoint that says, okay, this is the challenge of our lifetimes. We didn't ask for this, but it's here. Let's get on that. Let's do something about it. So many people seem to have moved straight to giving up. And with that, a sense of climate despair. That for the last 2 or 3 years, I'd say the most frequently asked question that I get about this comes in one of two flavors. Either isn't it already too late, or we're really done for, aren't we? And there are less polite ways of framing that second one. And I've come to think that climate despair, the giving up, the climate grief, and you'll see it in so many of the publications in the climate space, really solid, smart, effective campaigners giving up. And just saying, well, we're going to learn how to just cope with this reality that there's nothing we can do, when that's not true, right? And I've really formed the opinion, if not the conclusion, that the only way we're guaranteed to lose this is if we assume that there's nothing that we can do, and if we assume that all's already lost. And so I really try to counter that despairing, understand the grief, counter to the despair, and try to help folks find a way back to doing something about it in any conversation on the issue. For some reason, hang on, there we go. A lot of the momentum that we're seeing now goes back to October 2018, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a United Nations agency, released its report on 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways. 1.5 degrees average global warming over the pre-industrial levels is considered the most promising pathway to stabilize the global climate and hold off the worst effects of climate change. When this report was released in 2018, Oxfam made the point that every 0.1 degrees between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming, which was the previous generally accepted international target, that every 0.1 degrees Celsius between 1.5 and 2 can be measured in lives saved or lost. So if the stakes are really high, you could say the same about every 0.1 degrees between 1 and 1.5, but that's why the 1.5 degree target has really come to the fore over the last 5 years or so. To me, one of the most important moments when this report was released was that the IPCC held a news conference in Incheon, South Korea, and one of their scientists from the UK, Jim Skia, basically said a lot more elegantly than I ever do when I try to paraphrase him, that we know what to do about this, right? And we have the technology, it's proven, it's cost effective, it's practical, it's ready for prime time. Scientists don't speak that way, and in many ways that's a good thing. But he said the last box we have to tick is political will. And if you take yourself back to October 2018, that was a moment when we were a year away from a federal government. And I mean this any government comments I make are at a policy level, not in a partisan tone. But in October 2018, we were at a point where we did not know whether a government that had brought in a middling carbon price and spent 3 years in a pitched battle for it, whether they were going to survive politically. We knew that at least 2 provincial governments had been brought down largely by carbon pricing. We knew that Australia at the time was in the 2nd term, they're now in the 3rd term, of a vicious climate denying government that was brought to power largely by a carbon tax and the fomented reaction to that carbon tax. So it was really hard to avoid the conclusion that sure, we'll go out there and demand political will because that's what we do. And that's our part in the piece as campaigners and advocates and strategists. And then any politician that actually delivers on that will go to the polls and find out that no good deed goes unforgiven. Right? And so that picture has started to shift, but not enough. As with so many of this, it needs to shift more. And so where that comment from Skia has really guided a lot of my work since is with the idea, and Kathy, I see you in the participant list. I learned this first at the Ottawa Board of Education, so thank you. That since genuinely, that if we're going to demand political will, there needs to be public demand to back that up, right? So that we know that the advances we make won't be lost term by term. And you must be laughing that it took me this long to learn this and acknowledge that, right? Really going for the public awareness, public demand, and momentum for the scope and the speed of change that we need. The next report shortly after IPCC was the Canada's Changing Climate Report, published by the federal government. It was a national assessment of climate impacts now and in the future in Canada. And it found that the country is warming at twice the average global rate, that the Arctic is warming at 3 times the rate. And it projected a range of between 1.8 and 6.3 degrees average global warming over time, if the trends that we're on don't change. But in all of these reports, there have been innumerable science reports since the Canadian assessment. They're almost invariably dire. But what I always listen for is that pretty much without exception, what these reports are doing is what the science is supposed to do. It takes present trends, it projects into the future, and it says, okay, this is what this is going to look like. If we keep on our current path, this is what's going to happen. And so the reports are dire. But the story in back of that is that the window for action is getting narrower, but it hasn't closed. Okay, the future that these reports project is something that's within our hands to avert. And so I think the most important message from the science still is that the last chapters of this story have not yet been written, and that together we do have the power to write them. And that's why I think it's so important to listen to Dr. Kate Marvel, who is a climate scientist with NASA in the United States. And by the way, I have to do this. We have a climate scientist named Kate Marvel, okay? How can we lose? Okay, I have her permission to say that once in a while. But this quote was in the New York Times in November 2018. It's worth pointing out, she said, that there is no scientific support for inevitable doom. And Marvel and a few other scientists have been making the point with the IPCC's target, which is 45% by 2030, that there's nothing magical about those numbers, right? I mean, to focus people's minds, to get the coverage, to get a headline, you need to boil it down to the basics, and 45% by 2030 is the basic. But she makes the point, if we hit 44% by 2031, or 51% implausibly by 2029, right? We'll still be in a climate crisis. We will still have lost decades of ground, and we'll still have the opportunity to change it. So incrementally missing 45% by 2030 won't be the end of the world, literally or figuratively. But we need to get on it. It's a big target. It's achievable, but we have to keep moving. So on the road to COP, just a quick explanation of why this year's climate change conference matters so much. Something that I didn't appreciate until I attended my first UN climate conference, and this was the Paris conference in 2015. I've attended 3 of them since 2015 through 2017, or 3 in total through 2017. Not every annual conference is meant to be sort of a moment for really rapid, effective movement forward. Just because of the way the international negotiating process works, and I'm sure many or some of you have been involved in that kind of process in different issue areas, it's absolute hell trying to get consensus among 195 countries, even if everybody's there in good faith. And on a lot of the issues, a lot of the time, many of them aren't. So the process is that you work toward a moment, you work toward a conference where all of the elements are lined up, and you're aiming for a leap forward. And then for a few years, you consolidate, you continue the negotiations, you move toward the next moment. Paris was one of those moments. The UN climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009 was supposed to be until it collapsed, and a lot of people went home in tears, except for Saudi Arabia and Russia, because they got what they wanted. And then Glasgow in 2020 was supposed to be the next moment, and that got postponed because of the pandemic. And so now it's happening this year. But the intent under the Paris Agreement, it was understood from the very beginning that the agreement was intended to focus the world on a new set of targets and a new way of meeting them, but we weren't going to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees in one shot, just because it's such a complicated process at the international level. And so the intent was in COP speak to ratchet gradually, to have a conference every 5 years where countries came forward with more ambitious climate targets. And 2020 was supposed to be that year. Now it's 2021. The early indications are mixed. We do have the European Union promising a 55% carbon reduction by 2030. They're appropriately above the 45% global target, because this is a wealthy part of the world that both has the resources to move farther faster and also has the history of having derived the large majority of the benefit the industrialized world has from the fossil fuel era. So certainly at an international scale, and just intuitively, it makes sense that the countries that have the wherewithal should move first, move fastest, and Europe is committing to 55%. China promised in September that they would be peaking their emissions by 2030 and aiming for carbon neutrality by 2060. There are still some questions as recently as the last week or so about how they're actually going to do that, what it's going to consist of, whether they're beginning to relent a little bit on the details of how they plan to achieve this. And that's just standard. There will always be that sort of forward and then sliding back. But China's announcement was still, to some degree, unexpected and potentially transformative. And then the Biden administration is now under pressure to hit 50% by 2030. And there's some analysis that says that they should be somewhere between 53 and 67% to actually hit their fair share. But 50% is it ain't nothing. It's a real step forward, and there's a lot of work going on to try to hold them to that level. Canada, you might recall that under Stephen Harper, our target was a 30% greenhouse gas reduction from 2005 levels by 2030, so 30 by 30. And the current government came to power in 2015 with a promise to improve on that. Both the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister at the time, who's our local MP here in Ottawa Centre, said that 30% would be the floor, not the ceiling, on Canada's climate ambition. They said it multiple times. So hey, promise kept. At the end of December, it took more than 5 years. With great fanfare, they announced our new target. incrementally more than 30 or fractionally more than 31%. Are we happy yet? And of course, if the provinces all play along, maybe Canada will get to 40% by 2030. So there's a lot of work still to be done at home, and some pretty fundamental contradictions, I think, still in the way that federal strategy is rolling out. This is what things look like globally. I apologize that the map is a little bit or a lot hard to read. But the things to draw from this are that until the pandemic hit, every country of the world was supposed to come forward with its more ambitious target under the Paris Agreement by the end of last year. Now, the sort of the next looming deadline is that President Biden in the United States is hosting a climate leadership summit on Earth Day, April 22nd. The US will be publishing its updated target, and the hope is that other countries might as well by then. Certainly far enough in advance of Glasgow to establish momentum. Those 113 countries that you see listed at the bottom of the at the bottom right of the slide need to come forward with new targets. They need to be more ambitious targets. You see here that there's a lot of territory in red, Russia, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, where they have, countries have already made it clear that they are not going to be improving on their original targets under the Paris Agreement. But what's interesting here is the blank space. You see, again, the United States, Canada, India are not included in the calculations so far of how we're doing, and that matters to some of the material that I'm about to present. And as well, although China's listed here as having stronger targets under the agreement, again, there's a hope and an expectation perhaps that through negotiation, China will agree to move farther, faster, and maybe more substantively toward that peaking by 2030, before 2030 promise. This was the headline when the election result became known in the United States. And this again was from Climate Action Tracker. At the moment that Biden and Harris won, the analysis was that, and this was our lead paragraph, coupled with China's pledge to bring emissions to net zero by 2060 and the EU, Japan, South Korea's commitment to reach net zero by 2050, a tipping point is being approached that puts 1.5 within reach. So really at that moment, I mean, you know, for anybody who thought that election hadn't been stolen, it was an incredibly, the way I phrased that was weird. Of course it wasn't stolen, sorry. But it was an incredible moment of optimism, both with the United States finally rejoining the global community on climate change, and we hope so many other issues, but that there had been other momentum as well, not just about the US, it's about everybody getting in here, and everybody, with the exceptions I was pointing to earlier, has been getting in here to one degree or another. However, that was about the future ahead as far as what we've achieved so far. And this whiplash between the two slides, you know, we're within striking distance, but wait, it's a red alert. One of the sometimes confusing aspects of this work is that both things are true. A lot of the time, both things are true. And here we have the UN Climate Secretariat reporting that based on the commitments that the UN has received so far, so again, think of all those countries they haven't heard from officially yet, we're on track to cut emissions 0.5% by 2030, when what we need is 45%. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called it a red alert. The UN Climate Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, told media, the message is extremely clear. We are collectively wandering into a minefield, blindfolded. The next step would mean disaster, which does not mean it's all over. But once again, just coming back to this point that we need new ways of working on this, new ways of talking about it, thinking about it, to build a wider constituency for climate action. And here's the scope of the opportunity. In the month or so before the IPCC report, this was the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, saying that the bold action that was needed in any case to address the climate crisis could deliver at least $26 trillion in economic benefits through 2030, produce more than 65 million low carbon jobs, prevent 700,000 premature deaths, and generate $2.8 trillion in government revenues in that year. Pre-pandemic, they were saying that there was a 2 or 3 year window for the right investment decisions to be made that would carry us through the next 10 to 15 years. And I have to assume that's been postponed a bit. given the pandemic, but we're obviously on a timeline here. And here are some of the elements of most of the low carbon scenarios that I've really ever seen anywhere. The first is to drastically increase the energy efficiency of everything, because the most practical, most affordable way to reduce carbon is just to reduce our energy use before we even, before it even happens. The cheapest unit of energy is the one that we never have to produce. Decarbonize the grid, phase out coal, which in Ontario we've done. Phase out what somebody was calling the embarrassing gas problem. We're so mature here in the climate community, where Ontario still burns fossil gas, natural gas, in power plants, and many jurisdictions do. Gas is not the clean fuel that the industry has been touting for decades. It's a climate bomb because it is increasingly fracked gas, and that means that inherent to the production process is that lots of methane escapes into the atmosphere. Many of the companies are not terribly interested in measuring that methane properly, and methane is 84 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide in the 2 decades when we need to really be doing, getting it all done to get climate change under control. Decarbonizing the grids is also a matter of battery storage. It's a matter of distributed energy. So think rooftop solar, think off-grid renewables, for example, in Indigenous communities trying to get off diesel that costs them 60 cents a kilowatt hour. Once the grid's decarbonized, we can electrify everything, essentially. You see the shift to electric vehicles going on around you, but there's increasing interest and potential, and affordable potential, to electrify heavy industry that depends on fossil fuels, to electrify freight. And I have to pause on this point, just as a measure of how fast things are going. Nearly, but not quite a decade ago, I was involved in a low carbon modeling project for Canada. And one of the things we realized that with the bookshelves of reports, physical and virtual, that had been done on energy in Canada, nobody had actually done a consolidated inventory that we could find of whether we could generate enough low carbon energy by 2050 to hit the target in Canada. And the spoiler is, yes, we can. But when I look back on that report, I don't remember us ever deciding this consciously, but we tacitly left out anything that wasn't going to be viable by 2030. And that makes sense, because given the time that it takes for a new technology to really scale up, if we assumed, say, a decade ago, that whatever sort of bright, shiny, science fiction today was going to become a viable option by 2030, and we hinged a low carbon scenario on it, and then that wasn't available in 2030, those last 20 years might not be enough time to catch up, depending on how heavily we were relying on it and what else was available. So significantly, less than a decade ago, this scenario, it included onshore wind turbines, but not offshore. When in fact, the offshore is absolutely booming now, and there are longer conversation about how and why. We didn't assume that storage batteries would be particularly significant, and of course now they're booming. We did not assume that freight could be electrified, because there was no technology available at the time that would carry that weight, that distance. And now you see large elements of the ground freight industry being electrified. So even in the last decade, things have moved so fast and so affordably that some of the options we just weren't prepared to look at fairly recently are now ready for prime time. Natural sequestration is essential through farm soils, through forests, and then just mentioning personal habits and lifestyles, but with the really important caveat that both things are true. We can make a contribution in our own lives, but it's just the start. It's not the whole story. This is one of my all-time favorite cartoons because it points to the shift in perspective that I think we need, the shift in mentality and messaging, that for all the time that we've been trying to confront the climate crisis, and I think anybody in the climate community has been guilty of this, I know I certainly have been, we approach this from the perspective of crisis, because it is a crisis. But the assumption that ends up creating is, okay, fine, we have to deal with it. Okay, fine, we get that. But it's, we have to take our medicine, it's gonna hurt. Well, what if addressing the climate crisis and getting this done in a way that solves the problems, the concerns, the priorities that people already woke up with in the morning. Okay, what if adopting those opportunities means that action on climate change, as Mike said in the intro, is about opportunity and gain, not loss and pain? For so often, for at least 2 or 3 decades that I can remember, climate people have been talking about co-benefits, and I thought that was such a cool term when I first heard it. And what it meant was, you know, pre-pandemic, your life was that you commuted 2 hours each way each day, you know, to get to and from work, and you're afraid maybe you'll have to at least 3 days a week once the pandemic lifts. Well, to my mind, the correct answer to that is not, oh, just join us to deal with climate change, help us out at the next UN climate conference, and we'll get around to dealing with urban sprawl, maybe, because that's a co-benefit of climate action. Maybe cutting carbon is the co-benefit of that person actually knowing that they'll be able to get home at 4 p.m. for their daughter's soccer practice at the only moment in the known history of the universe when she's 8 years old. Instead of saying to people, and no one would ever do this, but we imply it, instead of saying, we know you never want to have to take your child to the asthma ward again in an emergency. I've been there. Instead of that, why not, but, you know, just join us on climate change, you know, join us on the climate campaign, and, you know, we'll cleanse the air, we'll shut down the coal plant eventually. Maybe focusing on that problem is where we find out that the carbon cuts are the co-benefit, but we still get the carbon cuts. So to this conversation about spin and substance, there are a few conversations going around that I would just suggest you be watchful for, because they're complex, but they're nuanced, but there are areas where we need to get the story right. And the first is the whole idea that net zero is not zero. We have seen just a flurry, an avalanche of net zero commitments from governments, from corporations, from banks, from investors. And a lot of the time, not always, but much of the time, two things are true about that. They're sincere, they're genuine. But because they're still figuring out how to actually deliver on the promise, the commitments tend to be weighted way more towards 2050 than they are towards 2030, when we need fast action as well as deep action. And secondly, a large proportion of the carbon emissions are often hinged on some form of carbon capture or carbon offsets, or some accounting measure that is legitimate if it works, but can actually leave them still with significant emissions rather. And they're kind of sort of tacitly promising on somehow catching that up elsewhere. Carbon offsets are a leading example of that that problem or that challenge. A carbon offset can be legitimate. It essentially means that somebody who's an emitter pays money to somebody who has a carbon solution. So if you're superficially, if you're a fossil fuel company, you invest in a renewable energy development to offset your fossil fuel output. There are a bunch of different technical requirements to make that offset legitimate. And you know, we can go into them in the Q&A if you really want to, but the point is that the devil really is in the details. It is so easy to get it wrong, even with best intentions, and certainly when the intentions are not good. A couple of things we'll see, and certainly from the larger fossil fuel companies, we like calling them colossal fossils on the energy mix. They'll say, "Oh, sure, you know, we're gonna keep. Come on, we can't stop drilling for oil and gas." They'll say, "but we'll plant trees." Well, it's very clear in the 1.5 degree report that one does not offset the other. We need a managed decline in fossil fuel production by 2050, and not all of it happening in 2050. It has to start now. And we need to massively reforest and go for other natural climate solutions to begin drawing down some of the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So you can't treat that as an offset if they are separate pursuits. There may be times when it can be done, but it has to be done carefully, diligently, honestly, and it has to follow the science. And that's where the complexity comes in. We'll also occasionally see companies talk about offsetting about what their emissions would otherwise have been. And I really hate to say that Mark Carney the former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, one of the leading, perhaps the leading voice in international climate finance, who is also a vice president at Brookfield Infrastructure in Toronto. His company recently tried to make the case that they were offsetting emissions against what they would otherwise have emitted if they hadn't taken action. And sorry, that's not legitimate. Everyone's entitled to make mistakes, but that's not legitimate. It's not, it doesn't actually draw down emissions. And so we have to be so careful watching for what amounts to spin, you know, and I have trouble believing that a Mark Carney would deliberately do that. Again, we're all allowed to make mistakes, but it's an important thing to hold organizations to account for if it happens. Industrial carbon capture, you will have seen that the Alberta government is hoping for a $30 billion 10-year commitment in next month's federal budget to subsidize carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That is essentially a way of continuing the fossil fuel industry, continuing the carbon pollution that it produces. Industrial carbon capture could be a half-hour talk, and it would not necessarily be a happy one. But one thing to keep in mind is that we've been hearing for years, decades, that the fossil industry in Alberta, in Newfoundland and Labrador, is committed to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. They'll tell you that they're making great progress, even though they've been stalling out at it lately. But what they're doing is trying to decarbonize the emissions that they actually produce, that they actually generate while they're extracting their product. The moment that product crosses the border, they're no longer responsible for it under international carbon accounting rules, which means that for a barrel of oil extracted anywhere, about 80% of that, about 80% of the emissions happen when that barrel actually reaches its end user and is used as directed. So even if the Canadian industry could completely decarbonize, and that's a very big if, and even if industrial carbon capture could help them do that, none of that accounts for the emissions that cross the border, and again, for about 80% of what they're responsible for. And then you will hear a whole menu, a whole palette of color codes for hydrogen as the technology comes on. You'll hear about green hydrogen, which is produced from renewable electricity, gray hydrogen, which is most of the hydrogen now being produced in the world, which is generated from fossil fuels. You'll hear about blue hydrogen, which is gray hydrogen, but oh, it's okay, we're storing the carbon underground. Again, so industrial carbon capture. And again, this is a much longer story, but just to say that hydrogen is another one of those technologies that have been surging lately. There are some applications where it does have potential, but please don't let anybody get away with presenting it to you as a sort of an all-in solution. There are no single solutions to this, and hydrogen is certainly not one of them. Blue hydrogen is certainly not one of them, because it's essentially a continuation for the fossil gas industry and all the methane that it emits. And then finally, you'll be hearing about small modular nuclear reactors as the latest attempt at a renaissance for the nuclear industry. I'll be happy to take this up in the Q&A, but just to say very quickly that from the PR, we've been hearing small modular reactors are ready to roll out. They're affordable, they're ready for prime time. In fact, from what I understand, as of about 9 months ago, the detailed engineering hasn't even been done. One of the experts in nuclear technology and economics that I rely on fairly heavily calls them PowerPoint reactors, because PowerPoint is the only place they exist. So, Mike or Barbara, I'm going to ask for a time check, because I think we're close to the half hour that I promised not to go, didn't want to go over.
You're over a tiny bit, but I wouldn't worry. Just wrap it up soon. And
I was so afraid this would happen. I am so sorry.
It's like you're predicting them. You answer them on the next slide, but just go ahead and maybe a couple more.
Okay, I apologize for that, folks. I will. I'll try to wrap up as fast as I can. So this this slide actually comes from COP17. It was the UN climate conference in Durban in 2011. And this was the UN climate conference where Anjali Appadurai, who is now working at Sierra Club BC at the time, was a youth delegate to the conference, gave the closing talk, and basically said to these delegates gathered from around the world, "You've been negotiating all my life. What are you doing?" But one of the most hopeful and, to me, memorable moments, I wasn't in Durban, but was following it a little bit from a distance at that point. You know, to me, this slide just really summed up where we are, where we can take this, where we need to take it. And it goes back to one of the other most commonly asked questions that I hear in this work. You know, again, one of them is, isn't it already too late? But the other is, what can I do? And it's the toughest to answer, because the real answer is, it depends. There is so much we can do, and it's a matter really of picking your point or points and seeing where you can have the most effective impact. So I'll run through some of those. There will be links on the slides, and I'm happy to share them afterwards if they go by too fast to take them down. It does begin with personal actions, with our consumption choices. I mean, we've been told for 30 years that if we just sort of do our bit, and, you know, sort of change out our light bulbs, do our recycling, if we want to be really extreme, do our composting, even though we hate it, that'll be enough, that'll get the climate crisis under control. That's not true. And in fact, we've been hearing just over the last few months that traces back to a greenwashing campaign that was mounted by BP about 30 years ago. And all of us absorbed it. And it's not to say that we should not be doing things in our own lives. Of course we should, if only to remind ourselves that we're there. We can be practicing reuse and repair and being more attentive to the sort of the stuff and the goods that we already have in our hands. It's important to think about emissions and about life cycle emissions whenever we make major purchases, whenever you do a retrofit or a renovation of any kind in your home or anywhere else that you're involved in. The example that I really like, and this is not applicable to as applicable to a home retrofit, but I saw a statistic that in industry, when it's time to buy a new motor, the focus is all on the purchase price of the motor, when 85 or 95% of its lifetime emissions come from the energy that it uses. So that speaks to, yes, decarbonize and bring down the cost of energy, but also think about the motor you're buying. Think about the devices you're buying at the point of purchase. You know, more of a sort of a home-focused example is the time to think about rooftop solar is not the year after you replace the roof, it's 2 years before, so that you can integrate that with the project when you're already there and reduce the cost of actually doing the extra. We live in a condo, and it's a condominium, and it's astonishing to find out that in Ontario, the good news is that there are rules for condos to maintain a financial reserve to pay for the replacement of major building components as they get to the end of their useful life. That's the good news. The bad news is that the Act requires condos to replace items up to the level of quality and up to the standard that was in place when the building was first built. Yeah, we are in a 10 or 11-year-old building, and I can tell you the technology has really advanced. We're in a LEED Platinum building, but the technology has really advanced in 10 years. And I think for anybody living in a condo, anybody on a condo board in particular, it's a really interesting conversation. What are we going to do with our replacement reserve, and how can we rethink that through the lens of the building's potential to reduce energy use and its need for resilience as the climate emergency continues. Size and location of living space. There have been lots of research lately showing that the improvements we've been able to make in building energy efficiency have been offset by the increasing size of homes. And then there was reference earlier to you know, people just bound and determined to start traveling again after the pandemic, and there's a lot of concern that aviation emissions will rise fast. That, you know, people going on cruises, that's a massive environmental burden for carbon and other impacts. So these are things we can do in our own lives. At the congregational level, I know First Unitarian's been involved with fossil fuel divestment, and reinvestment is another option. There is a campaign currently running, and I should have included the link to this, but I can provide it afterwards, to try to put consumer pressure on the big 5 banks in Canada that are consistently listed among the most egregious investors in new fossil fuel projects, oil and gas, coal, The gas ban campaign, there is a campaign underway currently to get city councils to pass resolutions asking the Ontario government to phase out gas-fired electricity as soon as possible. And the city of Toronto just signed on to that last week. And once again, I thought I'd put a link into the slide for this, but I can provide that if anybody wants to follow up. Crucially, as I was suggesting earlier, we need to reach outside the bubble and find ways not only of talking to, but listening to people who don't wake up with climate change as their first priority when they start their day, and discover together with them how working together on carbon will help them get what they already need and want faster and better. And one excellent resource for that is kitchen table conversations. I don't know if any of you know Lynn Adamson in Toronto, but she's been running these sessions and trainings for some time now. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is that the next one is tomorrow evening. Holding institutions to account at all levels, governments at all levels. It is essential in this work, I believe, to be partisan for the action, regardless of political party. We know that there's a municipal election coming up in October 2022. So that means at a practical level, we're in pre-election now. At the provincial level, parties are in the midst of the nomination process. So it's so important for people who are prepared to prioritize climate change to get our support if they decide to stand provincially, whether it's as incumbents or challengers. And again, I say that across the political spectrum, which takes us to the Green PAC vision. Green PAC formed in 2015. I've been a volunteer or sometimes an advisor with them from the beginning. And their hope is to have environmental and climate advocates in place in every corner of every legislature in the country. They operate at the federal and provincial level at this point. And the goal is that it no longer ever be a debate that climate and sustainability have to be at the center of policy. The question can and should be how we implement, but not whether we get it done. Municipal action, Ecology Ottawa is a great case to start. There is a major segment of work going on right now on the city's official plan. And if that's of interest, Ecology Ottawa can point you in that direction. Unfortunately, there was an intensely frustrating and therefore obviously failed effort last year at this time to get a limit on the expansion of the urban boundary. And there is a concern that it's pretty much impossible for a city to be sustainable if it keeps sprawling. So the official plan work is the sequel to that, and some of the same people are working on it. Seniors Action Climate Legacy is a new organization that began forming a little over a year ago. I know that they have been focusing more on action on pensions and how pension funds can factor climate change into their investment decisions. And I'm not currently up on what else they've been doing. And just the point that companies have been listening. We've been hearing that their audience research is showing that customer concern about the climate crisis is on the rise. They're hearing it. They're segmenting it by age and by other demographics, but they're getting the message. Employees are an overwhelming influence on many of the companies that we hear from, partly because fossil fuel jobs are evaporating. So the people who would otherwise be trying to fill those jobs are trying to go to places that are doing something about the climate crisis. We're hearing that students interviewing for law firms are questioning those firms on whether they represent carbon polluters. So all of this is beginning to happen. Once again, the question is whether the impetus for change is coming from the PR office or the engineering department. It's really essential to get pressure on these businesses and on government and all of our institutions of society to get the substance right and really be serious, but not only about hitting a real zero target by 2050, but to institute rapid emission reductions now so that we can hit or that you can try to exceed that 45% target by 2030. I think it's best to go to questions and discussion at this point. And again, I'm sorry I went over.
Okay.
Might be predicted.
Well, excellent. Like I say, you were answering some questions as you went on, so
Whatever leaves.
that's good.
That doesn't excuse going over. I'm sorry.
Yeah. There are a few questions about offsets, and maybe I'll just ask: is there any good offsetting?
More that there is a standard for what to look for in a good offset. And I haven't checked this for a while and should have, I apologize. The David Suzuki Foundation had a really good explainer on their website at one point. It has to be legitimate, obviously. It has to be a real project and not spun. It has to be additional. It has to be something that would not have happened without the offset investment. And once again, I did cover this in the talk, but a really crucial point is that with so many of the offsets now, companies are saying, oh, we'll plant trees. Well, no, that's a whole separate category, and that has to be done in its own right. You can't do the tree planting that's needed, but then emit more fossil fuels because you've just added to the emissions load.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. There are a few technical questions, and you touched on hydrogen and small modular reactors, for instance. Batteries are getting used everywhere now, whether it's in batteries are getting used everywhere now, whether it's, in transportation or supporting electrical grids. What's your belief about the environmental attributes of batteries?
It's a really important issue that needs to be addressed. There are serious concerns about the metals, the rare earths that go into production of lithium-ion batteries. There are just hideous human rights concerns around elements like cobalt. And I guess there are a couple of points. One is that lithium ion will probably not be the final landing point. There's a lot of work being done on new battery chemistries, and it's coming along. It's not here yet, but the work is being done, and I think partly motivated by this concern, both the environmental and the human rights concern. It really underscores something that I've been seeing a lot. I should mention that we scan about 1,200 headlines a week to write the mix. So that's a good starting point for keeping track of some of this stuff at least a little bit. And it's been really heartening to see a lot of coverage and analysis about this issue, because to my mind, pardon me, I'm going to mute before I do this. Excuse me. To my mind, that really speaks to a seriousness and a badly needed seriousness about getting those details right. We have seen legacy energy industries that carry their own hideous environmental impact. And I've heard people in the climate community say, yeah, sure, batteries have impact, but it's nothing like the fossil fuel industry. I don't have evidence for that. It wouldn't surprise me. But that's not the answer. We're doing this because we're trying to do something better. We're not just trying to replace one hideous polluter with another. We're trying to replace a hideous polluter and build a better world. And for everybody. That includes kids who are currently mining cobalt in the Congo. And so we have to sweat the detail. We have to get it right. It's not there yet. The other point that I was about to make is that it's been really nice to see, I think, healthy debate, healthy backlash, I'll say, to the idea that electric vehicles are a panacea because everyone will just get rid of their internal combustion vehicles. The pushback is let's electrify transit. And by the way, that means not building the next phase of the LRT with, seriously, diesel vehicles. It's 2021. It's Ottawa, but it is 2021. So yeah, sure, EVs, electric vehicles, electric freight vehicles when we need vehicles, but public transit as well, because that is so much more efficient and will address this supply chain issue to some degree. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Richard Franson has posted in the chat, and it's quite long, but the important aspect, I think, is this first sentence: are there concerted efforts in Ottawa to engage youth as climate leaders in climate change actions?
You're asking, are there concerted efforts?
Concerted efforts to
yes, and I can find links for that. Fridays for Future has a local chapter. I would say that generally a number of the campaign organizations in Ottawa have been engaging with, building from within communities that have been traditionally too often left out of this work. Youth, Indigenous communities, racialized communities. There's been a lot of that work going on in Ottawa, and I would say right across the climate community. I'm trying to think, I haven't actually seen this quantified, but certainly my very strong impression is that in the year of the pandemic, there's been a real deepening and widening of the understanding that these crises are connected, that we have a climate crisis, that we have a crisis of economic inequality, of social and racial inequality, and that that we won't solve one without solving all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And again, I'll be happy to provide links to local organizations.
Yeah. Ken Gibson in our congregation talks about how he read a book actually that mentioned how the pandemic has helped make people a little bit more introspective about what's going on and think about some of these issues, and it's helped to make people more resolute about taking some actions.
Let's hope. I mean, there's been so much talk about both talk and some policy about building back better. Mm-hmm. And yet there was a major study released last week that indicated that only 18% of the recovery dollars actually went to green recovery. And I have some questions about how that was measured, but it's still a pretty low number. We're starting to see, I'm sure you're starting to see a lot of the coverage now saying, oh, people can't wait to get back to the way it was, whatever the new normal is going to be. We'll be traveling, we'll be spending like mad. And of course, the sort of the alarm goes off in the back of the front of my mind. Okay, well, are we going to forget about emissions?
Yeah.
And it really needs, whatever we do next, we need to do better than before.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And once again, that's not always in our personal control. Mm-hmm. We could spend every waking minute trying to get our own personal and household emissions down. And in the end, letting institutions off the hook, because it would be that level of commitment if we just really decided to consistently go there. And if everyone in the world did all of those things consistently all the time, and there are a lot of good reasons folks won't consistently, everybody, it would get us 40% of the way to where we need to go. It has to be institutional change. It has to be structural change. And that's why our personal commitments have to be a gateway to that sort of next step of congregational action, group action, and holding institutions to account.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll ask this last question, and when you're done answering, I think we'll be open to questions directly from people who are on and not recording anymore. But first, you is going to send a large intergenerational delegation to the UU office at the UN event, all in for climate justice, food equity, and sustainability in April. Can you say a little bit more about the impact of climate trends on food and an escalating refugee crisis? And you alluded to it at the beginning, just loss of life ultimately from temperatures changing.
The impacts are already there and already very serious on both. You'll see a lot of material. You'll see a lot of material on the impact, first of all, of the food system as it currently runs on the climate crisis. The latest I saw, but I haven't read into this yet, is that food accounts for about 1/3 of emissions. So once again, let's not lose focus on the fossil fuel industry, but we need to be able to do more than one thing at a time. The climate crisis is already driving multi-year drought, driving the risk of multi-breadbasket food failure, all the crop failure, although that's a little bit still, that concern is a little bit still in the future, but it's certainly on the discussion list. And all of this, of course, drives migration. This is not an area that I'm expert in, but I've seen material indicating, for example, that, excuse me, if only I had my voice. I've seen analysis showing that the large majority of the northbound migration at the Mexico-US border is driven by drought, crop failures, hunger, driven in large part by the climate crisis. So that's already happening now, and it's projected to get worse. The Horn of Africa has been in dire circumstances for some time now. I have lost count of the number of waves of swarms of locusts. I mean, literally plagues of locusts. And there's a connection there as well to climate conditions making it worse. So there's both the impact and the solution. Something I'm so grateful for, because on paper, this should just not happen. For, I guess, the last 5 years or so, I've been writing a monthly column for the tabloid newspaper of the Quebec Farmers Association. And the reason that should not happen is I've never worked on a farm, I've never lived on a farm, I've lived in cities all my life, and yet they're willing to school me, and I've needed it, and I've really appreciated it. It's fascinating talking to people who actually have their hands on this stuff. You're just getting the theory from me when it comes to farm practices. Talking to people who can point to the improvements in productivity, the improvements in profitability, the fact that this farm is now viable or is still viable because of changes they made to sequester carbon, to use, to be less reliant on nitrogen inputs, because nitrous oxide is a climate super pollutant. And what comes through so clearly is, again, you know, where's the benefit? Where's the co-benefit? Of course, people who work farms are concerned about the climate. They're also concerned about putting food on their tables, never mind ours. And if the first step is to keep this operation viable, whether it's new or whether it's been there for 5 generations, but then it's done in a way that you're sequestering carbon, well, super. You know, and you know, the farm sector can and should be a major part of the solution. A group called Farmers for Climate Solutions has just produced a pre-budget submission that gets at some of the initial steps that their sector can take with federal funding, because they've been terribly neglected on this. So, you know, both the impact, the risk, the urgency, and the action are all there.
Great. Okay, so just before we take oral questions, some people will be leaving now. So Mitch, I really want to thank you for a great talk, and thank everybody who attended today. It was